You have heard about Shaka Zulu, the warrior king who built the greatest military empire in sub-Saharan African history. You have heard about the Impondo Zankomo, the horns of the buffalo, the battle tactic that destroyed the British army at Isandlwana. You have heard about Cetshwayo, the last great Zulu king who faced the British Empire. But the Zulu Empire was not built by men alone. It was built by the women who fed the armies, who raised the warriors, who managed the royal homesteads, who held political power that no European observer understood or recorded. The history books kept one story and lost the other. This documentary tells the other story. The women who made the Zulu Empire possible, who shaped it, who fought for it, who survived its fall, and whose legacy lives in KwaZulu-Natal today in ways that the history books never thought to look for. To understand the women of the Zulu Empire, you first need to understand the world they inhabited. A world that European observers consistently misread because they brought European assumptions to African realities. The Nguni homestead, the Umuzi, was not simply a dwelling place. It was a complete economic and political unit, organized according to principles that placed women at its functional center. The cattle enclosure was the heart of the Umuzi, the measure of wealth, the basis of every marriage negotiation, every political alliance, every social relationship. Women did not own cattle, but they managed everything that made cattle ownership meaningful. The food, the household, the children, the labor that converted cattle wealth into sustainable civilization. European observers who visited Zulu homesteads in the 19th century consistently described women as oppressed, as laborers, as subordinates with no power. They were wrong, not completely. The Zulu social system was patriarchal, and women operated within real constraints. But the power that women exercised within those constraints was substantial and sophisticated. The most important woman in the history of the Zulu Empire was not a queen. She was never given a formal political title. Her name was Nandi. Her name meant the sweet one in Zulu. And the gap between her name and her life is one of the great ironies of the Zulu story. Nandi was a woman of the Elangeni clan who became involved with Senzangakona, the chief of the small Zulu clan. When Nandi became pregnant, the Elangeni denied it. They said she had an intestinal beetle, not a child. The baby was named for that beetle, Shaka. Senzangakona eventually acknowledged both Nandi and Shaka and brought them to the Zulu village. But the acceptance was always conditional, always hostile, always waiting for an excuse to become rejection. The expulsion, when it came, was brutal in its casualness. A dog killed one of Shaka's sheep in his care. The incident became the excuse for what had always been intended. They went to the Elangeni. They were not welcomed. They left. They went to the Nthethwa. And here, finally, they found something like stability. Every year of that wandering was an education for Shaka, in humiliation, in resilience, in the mechanics of power. But it was also an education for Nandi, in what her son was becoming. When Shaka became chief of the Zulu in 1816 and began to build his empire, Nandi became something new in Zulu society, something for which there was no existing title. She became the Indlovukazi, the great she-elephant, the most senior woman in the Zulu political system, a title that had real political weight and real political function. Nandi was not simply honored, she was consulted. She understood something that Shaka's generals did not. She understood the social fabric of the Zulu kingdom at the human level. The relationships, the grievances, the loyalties, the fault lines that no battlefield map could show. When she died in 1827, Shaka's response was so extreme that it changed the history of the Zulu kingdom. The grief that destroyed his reign had its roots in what Nandi had been to him, the only person who had stood beside him when he was nothing. At the center of every Zulu royal homestead was an institution called the Isigodlo. European observers who encountered it in the 19th century called it a harem. They were wrong. The Isigodlo was a political institution. It was a system by which the king built relationships with the most important families in the kingdom. Families sent their daughters to the Isigodlo as a mark of honor and a form of political alliance. The women of the Isigodlo were not prisoners. They were a political resource that operated with their own agency and their own ambitions. A woman in the Isigodlo who caught the king's attention could become a great wife. Her son could become king. The politics of the Isigodlo shaped Zulu succession for generations. Which son became king was determined in part by which mother had managed her relationships in the royal household most skillfully. The most senior women in the Zulu political system were the great wives. Their marriages were not personal arrangements, they were acts of state. A great wife was chosen from a specific clan to create a political alliance between the Zulu royal house and that clan. Her son would typically be in line for succession. This meant that every great wife was the center of a political faction from the moment she arrived in the royal household. The competition between great wives and their factions was sometimes the most consequential political force in the Zulu kingdom. After the death of Shaka, and throughout the reigns of Dingane Mbande and Cetshwayo, the politics of the Isigodlo and the great wives determined who ruled the Zulu kingdom. Every army that the Zulu Empire ever fielded was fed by women. This is not a metaphor. It is logistics. The Zulu Empire's military power rested on an agricultural base that women built and managed. Women were responsible for all agricultural production in Zulu society. They cleared fields. They planted. They cultivated. They harvested. They processed grain. They managed food storage. The processing of grain alone was a labor that consumed hours every day. Grinding sorghum and millet by hand with stone grindstones to produce the flour that made the daily porridge. The archaeological evidence suggests that Zulu women developed sophisticated grain storage systems that could preserve food for years. Insurance against drought. Insurance against crop failure. The long-term thinking that sustained communities through crisis. When the British imposed taxes on the Zulu population after the War of 1879, they imposed a hut tax, a tax on every dwelling. And because it was women who built the huts, women's labor was being directly taxed by an empire that had no idea it was doing so. Cattle were the foundation of Zulu wealth. Men owned cattle. But the daily management of the dairy economy that converted cattle into food was entirely women's work. Amasi, the fermented milk that was a staple of the Zulu diet, was produced entirely by women. Its production required knowledge of fermentation processes that were transmitted from mother to daughter across generations. The woman who could produce excellent amasi was a valued member of her community. Her skill was recognized and respected in ways that the historical record does not capture. The lobola, the bride wealth cattle that moved between families at marriage, was the foundation of the entire Zulu social system. And women were both its subject and its mechanism. A woman's lobola cattle remained connected to her throughout her life. If the marriage ended, or if she died without children, those cattle returned to her family. This gave women's families a continuing stake in their daughters' well-being. Every year at the start of the summer, rains the young unmarried women of the Zulu kingdom performed the umkosi womlanga, the reed dance. European accounts called it a spectacle, a display for the king's benefit, an opportunity for the king to choose new wives. They missed everything important about it. The reed dance was an annual demonstration of the kingdom's female population to its own political leadership. It was a census, a social network, a coming-of-age ceremony, a civic institution. Every young woman who participated was identified. Her family was known. Her health was visible. Her connection to the royal household was established. The reeds themselves carried symbolic meaning. A woman who carried an unbroken reed demonstrated her purity, her readiness for marriage, her family's honor. The reed dance gave women something that formal political structures denied them: public visibility, public recognition. A moment when the state looked at them and acknowledged their existence and their value. The Zulu oral tradition produced some of the most powerful poetry in African literary history. The Isibongo, the praise poems. The Isibongo tradition was dominated by men who praised men. The formal Imbongi was almost always male. But women had their own poetic traditions, their own isiki, their own ululation, their own forms of verbal art that carried their history and their experience. The grinding songs that women sang every morning while processing grain carried the history of the homestead and the family in their lyrics. When the British arrived and imposed colonial rule on Zululand after 1879, it was partially through women's songs that the memory of independence was kept alive in the places where history books were not. In January of 1879, the British Army crossed the Buffalo River into Zululand. The war that followed lasted 6 months. When it ended, the Zulu kingdom, as it had existed, was gone. The men of the Zulu kingdom fought and died and were captured. History recorded their names, their battles, their deaths. The women of the Zulu kingdom lost almost everything. History recorded almost none of it. The hut tax imposed by the British colonial administration fell most heavily on women. The disruption of the lobola system by colonial law and Christian missionary activity changed the social position of women in ways that were not always improvements. The Zulu kingdom was formally abolished. The territory was administered first by Britain and then by various South African colonial and apartheid governments. But what Zulu women had built could not be administered away. The umkhosi womhlanga, the reed dance, was suppressed during the colonial period and then the apartheid era, but it was never completely eliminated. In 1984, the reed dance was revived at the royal palace of the Zulu royal family. Today, tens of thousands of women participate in the umkhosi womhlanga every year. It is the largest traditional ceremony in South Africa. The women of the Zulu Empire were never given the history they deserved. But their legacy survived in the only way that has always mattered most. Through their daughters, through their songs, through their hands and their voices, and their daily insistence on building a life worth living, even when the world around them was doing everything it could to prevent it. The history books kept the warriors, but it was the women who kept the kingdom.